Hi, everybody. Welcome into tonight's webinar. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Hilarie Hicks, and she's going to tell us a little bit about James Maury tonight. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll have time for those at the end. And I hope you all enjoy tonight's program. So, Hilarie, it's all yours.
Okay, let me share screen and see if I get the screen that I'm looking for. And hopefully you are seeing James Maury, James Madison's Forgotten Friend, and you're not seeing any of my notes.
Looks good, Hilarie.
Great. So tonight's presentation is an expanded version of a talk I gave to a group of Maury family descendants when they visited Montpelier last year. And when our visitor center manager first contacted me about the group's visit, she said very tentatively, "They want to talk about James Maury. Do you know who that is?" And I said, "I know exactly who that is." Maury may not be as familiar a name as Madison or Jefferson, but in the research that I've done on James Madison and Montpelier, Maury's name comes up over and over again. So much so that I've come to think of him as one of my favorite informants. When I need to know what James Madison was selling, what he was buying, who he was exchanging friendly letters with, James Maury can often tell me what I need to know. James Maury's claim to fame was that he served as the first U.S. consul in Liverpool for 39 years, 1790 to 1829. So he was a pretty significant person in his day. James Maury was a native of Albemarle, Virginia, born in 1846. His father was the Reverend James Maury, a minister and schoolmaster. As an adult, James went into business with his brother Fontaine Maury in Fredericksburg. And then in 1786, James Maury moved to Liverpool to handle the British end of the family mercantile business. After George Washington appointed him consul in 1790, James Maury continued to conduct his own business in Liverpool, as well as carrying out his official duties as consul. The consul's role was to serve American citizens in Liverpool. He could assist travelers in emergencies. He could issue passports, promote trade between Liverpool and the U.S. So these are similar to some of the functions of an embassy, but an embassy would be located in a foreign capital, and an ambassador would outrank a consul, since an ambassador is their country's main diplomatic representative to the host country. So Maury did promote trade. He became the first president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Liverpool, which was composed of Liverpool merchants who did business with American merchants. He's still remembered in Liverpool today, where this plaque has been placed on one of his residences. But Maury is especially important to Montpelier researchers because of the paper trail he created through his correspondence with James Madison. One of the areas that I research is the operation of the Montpelier plantation. And a big challenge in doing that research is that many of the kinds of records that would be helpful to us no longer exist or have not turned up. Even though much of Madison's correspondence survives at the Library of Congress and other repositories, we don't have any plantation records along the lines of Jefferson's farm books. That kind of record of daily life probably didn't seem important enough to save. And there are several instances that we know of where people discarded or destroyed the unimportant papers. For instance, after the death of Madison's stepson, John Payne Todd, a family member arrived at Todd's home to find papers scattered on the lawn and learned that Todd's estate administrator had already discarded a number of papers. After Todd's estate sale, members of the extended Madison family purportedly discovered 2 rooms filled with personal letters. And after picking out a few items of interest, they, quote, determined to consign the telltale motley papers to the flames. according to a secondhand account. And Todd's executor ended up with a bureau containing some papers, only to have rats make a nest in them. So Montpelier's plantation records could have been in any of those batches of destroyed papers, or they could be still out there. Let's hope. But without those records to tell us about plantation operations, we have to scour Madison's letters for mentions of what crops were grown at Montpelier, what the Madisons bought with the proceeds. And that's where Madison's correspondence with James Maury becomes valuable. So let's look first at the crops raised by enslaved laborers at Montpelier and sold by Madison to merchants like Maury. Tobacco and wheat were the main cash crops for Montpelier and in Virginia generally. Tobacco depletes the soil over time, and so in the Virginia Piedmont by the 19th century, many planters of tobacco were becoming farmers of wheat instead. That was the terminology of the time. Planter usually meant tobacco, farmers, or farming indicated wheat. Several years ago, when Montpelier archaeologists were excavating a structure that could have been a tobacco barn or a wheat threshing barn, or could have been converted from one to the other, the question came up, did James Madison give up growing tobacco in favor of wheat? And if so, when? Madison's correspondence with merchants in Fredericksburg and Richmond was helpful in piecing together an answer for this question. But his correspondence with James Maury in Liverpool really held the key pieces to the puzzle. So to set the stage, at the time Madison first began to consign tobacco to Maury in the fall of 1788, he had not yet inherited Montpelier from his father, James Madison Sr. The younger James Madison owned two farms called Black Meadow and Sawney's Tract. Sawney's Tract was adjacent to the Montpelier home farm. Black Meadow was between Orange Courthouse and Gordonsville. So Maury, I'm going to get tongue-tied between Madison and Maury at some point in this talk, I know it. Madison would consign his tobacco to Fontaine Maury in Fredericksburg, who then shipped it to his brother James in Liverpool to sell. James Maury then sold the tobacco, credited to Madison's account, and used the proceeds to purchase items that Madison wanted. So this is what Maury wrote after the first shipment. He said, I now have the pleasure to hand you the sales of your 8 hogsheads tobacco, and that abbreviation HHDS, hogshead. Hogshead was a large barrel, 48 inches tall, 30 inches in diameter on the ends, which could carry about 1,000 pounds of tobacco. And then Maury says, the balance of which you may draw on for when you please. So meaning that there was now a credit on Madison's account, so he could order goods from Maury or write a note drawing on the account, essentially a check, if he wanted to spend the money some other way. And Maury says your tobacco was all heavy and well adapted for Africa and Flanders, which are generally favorable circumstances to the owner. So Maury always tried to explain what was going on in the broader market, particularly when, as was often the case, the sales prices were not quite as good as Madison hoped for. In August 1789, Maury wrote, you have been so obliging as to consign me some tobacco, and that's a common abbreviation, TOBO, for tobacco. You've been so obliging as to consign me some tobacco which have been landed but are not sold. Our staple commodity is much lowered in value in almost every European market, owing to the unusual abundance of the last crop, joined to an unusual meanness of quality. Yours is of the better sorts, yet far inferior to last year's crop. So the big picture is that tobacco prices are down because there's a glut on the market, plus the quality of this year's crop is not as good. Now, one piece of advice that Maury gave over and over was for Madison to have his tobacco stemmed. In other words, for the enslaved laborers to cut the stems from the tobacco leaves before packing them in the hogsheads. It was extra work and meant that it would take more tobacco leaves to fill the hogshead, but tobacco buyers in Liverpool would pay a premium price for tobacco that was prepared this way. In July 1791, Maury wrote, "Tobacco continues a very dull article, save for stemmed in general, and leaf of rare sorts. These go off at pleasing prices. If you destine your growing crop for this market, I recommend your having it stemmed very neatly. In drawing out the stem, especial care should be used that no part remain adhering to either side of the leaf." And again in November 1791, Maury reiterated, "I again repeat my recommendation that you give directions to have a part of your next shipment top stemmed. I think the superior proceeds would well reimburse the loss of the weight and labor." Now, we don't have the sales figures for every year, but in March 1794, Maury was able to sell Madison's stemmed tobacco for about twice the price of Madison's other tobacco. And that's the kind of very specific information about the plantation economy that we wouldn't know without Maury's letters. Both James Madison and his father brought less tobacco to market in the 1790s, probably due to the falling prices. Of course, when planters raised less tobacco, the price went up. That's always the planter or the farmer's dilemma. Maury wrote to Madison in 1796, "I was rather sorry for your own sake not to see any of your consignments this year. Tobacco at length is become in great demand and at very high prices." Now, we don't have any more letters between Madison and Maury for the rest of the 1790s. Possibly Madison stopped raising tobacco during those years, or he chose to sell it locally rather than overseas. James Madison Sr. died in 1801, and the Montpelier plantation passed to James Madison Jr. at that time. Shortly after his father's death, Madison left Montpelier to serve as Jefferson's Secretary of State for 2 terms, and then to serve as president himself for another 2 terms. Madison left Montpelier in the hands of an overseer, who was Gideon Gooch for most of those years, later Abraham Edens. But Madison continued to take as much of an interest in plantation operations as his time allowed. After dropping out of the Liverpool market in the 1790s, Madison resumed shipping tobacco to Maury in 1803. He stopped out again during the War of 1812. Maury held on to Madison's last shipment because the prices were so low, and sold it in small lots between 1812 and 1814, trying to get a better price. Madison appears to have stopped growing tobacco entirely for a few years in the mid-1810s. In 1819, James Maury communicated the expected tobacco prices to Madison through his son William Maury. Madison replied to William, "I am glad to hear that your father continues to enjoy good health, and I cannot feel regret that his opinion of the tobacco market is encouraging to the planter, having myself resumed the culture of that article." And that was a really significant letter for tracking Madison's tobacco production. He's telling Maury that he did indeed stop growing it for a while, but he has now resumed. And then that phrasing is so typical of Madison to say he cannot feel regret about the good prices. He just can't bring himself to say he's happy about the rising prices. Madison continued, "Our crops of it in this quarter particularly are short, owing to a drought almost without example, and the plants, owing to the same cause, are not large. The quality, however, is generally good. This is the case with mine, and unless I should be swayed by the price or the pressure of the times to sell the whole in the country, I propose to commit a few hogsheads of the best to his disposal. So he's planning to send some to Maury in Liverpool. Madison consigned 8 hogsheads of tobacco to Maury in 1820. But as it turned out, he did feel regret about the price he received. From that point on, he continued to grow tobacco, but he sold it only in Fredericksburg or Richmond. In 1823, he was even clearing forest land to try raising tobacco on virgin soil, hoping for better quality and price. Maury and Madison continued to discuss tobacco even after Madison stopped shipping to Liverpool. In 1822, Maury wrote, "It is indeed with pleasure that I see you had preferred the home to a foreign market for your tobacco, because I am pretty sure we could not have done as well for you here." Madison and Maury's letters give us other tidbits of information about Madison's tobacco production, including the variety planted at Montpelier, which was Big Frederick, the yearly weather conditions that affected Madison's tobacco, and market conditions at home and abroad. And I'll conclude this section with one last exchange between Maury and Madison. So Maury observed in 1828, "Tobacco is becoming as bad an article as I have known for the last 40 years, and for the best of reasons. You gentlemen planters grow too much," and Maury himself underlined those words in the letter. "My opinion is that a planter had better prefer the price where he is to the chance of better in Europe." Madison replied, "I cannot help thinking that the time not distant when the tobacco planter will have to decide whether it will be better to grow it for a price inadequate almost to any remuneration or not at all." So basically he's saying the tobacco prices aren't high enough to cover the expenses of growing it. So the planter has to choose between taking a price that doesn't allow him to break even or just giving up on growing tobacco. Madison did not choose that second option, to grow tobacco, not at all. And he had been growing wheat throughout his agricultural career. So to go back to the tobacco versus wheat question posed by our archaeologists, for Madison, there was no simple straight line transition from tobacco to wheat. Each year he weighed the options, betting on the prices and the market conditions, and trying to figure out the way to maximize his profits, whether with one crop or both. Madison even considered having James Maury sell his wheat flour in Liverpool, but Maury quickly discouraged him. Maury also shot down another idea of Madison's, to consign a shipment of black walnut musket stocks, which Madison thought he could produce from old black walnut trees, which his father had left standing in fields or pastures. So Madison and Maury's correspondence then is a wonderful resource for tracking Madison's tobacco production and sales. And in the absence of other plantation records, it's sometimes the only reference we have for certain years, particularly for Madison's temporary break from tobacco in the mid-18 teens. Well, now that we've seen how tobacco sales generated some income into Madison's account with James Maury, let's look at how Maury helped Madison spend his money. In January 1819, Madison wrote to James Maury with a request for a new set of dishes. He wrote, "Mrs. Madison wishes you to send her a crate of blue ware of a handsome pattern, well assorted, and containing a dinner set, with water decanters or goblets of good glass." And he continued, "Be so good as to add about 50 pounds of best cheese, divided into 2 cases. Madison apparently liked his English cheeses. In 1816, Maury had taken it upon himself to buy a Cheshire cheese and a Gloucester cheese for Madison when settling up his account. But going back to the blue and white dishes, this is showing you a fragment of blue and white china found by archaeologists at Montpelier. And it's the pattern most often found at Montpelier archaeological sites, called bamboo and peony, made by the British manufacturer Davenport and Company. And we think this is the very set of blue and white china sent to Madison by James Maury. So look closely at the border design and at the design in the center that seems to suggest a bridge. So this is an intact plate, not from Montpelier, but it is in the bamboo and peony pattern. And you can see how the border design is the same as we saw in the fragment. You can see that bridge in the center. And now you can also see the big bamboo shoot flanked by two giant peonies that gives the pattern its name. And this photo shows you a number of blue and white fragments found at Montpelier and matches them up with some intact examples. So everything above the yellow ribbon is bamboo and peony. So you've got two intact bamboo and peony plates or platters and parts of 4 bamboo and peony dishes. And we've got another platter here in the bamboo and peony pattern. This will be imprinted in your brain by the end of the talk. And here's some more bamboo and peony pieces that we've collected on a sideboard in the dining room. And incidentally, this is not the setting that you'll see in the dining room currently when you tour Montpelier. Right now, we have another different set of blue and white Chinese export porcelain on display, which has its own interesting history. So you can compare and contrast the next time you come to Montpelier. And here's another example of Maury shopping for the Madisons. In July 1820, when James Madison sent his last shipment of 8 hogsheads of tobacco to James Maury, he also included a shopping list from his wife, Dolly Madison. And she mainly ordered textiles, and you can read along in her handwriting there. She ordered some Irish linen, some fine sheeting, 12 pair of men's silk stockings, 6 white and 6 black, and then 4 pieces of furniture chintz of lively colors, with fringe to suit it all for the bed and windows of the same room. And then she finished up her order with some cambric muslin for dresses, some linen cambric for shirt ruffles, and a set of ivory-handled cutlery. It's the furniture chintz of lively colors that was of the most interest to our curatorial staff, because that became the basis of our furnishing plan for the upstairs bedchamber. And here's the finished and furnished bedchamber that you'll see when you're on tour, with bed hangings and matching window curtains in that lively colored chintz with fringe to suit it all. Now, I mentioned earlier that Maury sent cheese to Madison. On at least one occasion, he also sent wine to Madison on May the 6th of 1836. Now, by that time, Maury had returned to Virginia, so this may have been a gift rather than a purchase order. Maury wrote, "I have at length shipped by one of the coasting traders to Fredericksburg the sherry wine, of which I promised you a specimen in case it should prove good. I think it good, and particularly adapted for a nonagenarian, as I am. And although you are my junior, I think it will suit an octogenarian, as you are. I hope it will be so, and that you will like it." Madison replied, "The box of sherry wine I owe to your kindness came safe to hand the day before yesterday. Dr. Dunlanson being with us, and in the habit of drinking sherry, and a better judge than I could be, were my palate in better health, pronounces the wine to be of the first chop. It is, I doubt not, very fine, and I wish I could more safely indulge a relish for it. It gives me pleasure to learn that you can safely do so, as I hope the sherry may prove with you what has been said of good wine, a milk for old age. I really love this exchange between two old friends making joking remarks about being in their 80s and 90s. Now, James Maury was not the only person who acted as James Madison's agent, either in selling Montpelier's agricultural products or purchasing goods that the Madisons wanted. But Madison and Maury had more than a business relationship. They had a long-standing friendship that pre- and post-dated their business dealings. Now, it's not clear to me when Madison and Maury met. It may have been in their early years. Maury's daughter, Anne, wrote that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had been her father's classmates at the school of her grandfather, the Reverend James Maury. And she was correct that Jefferson and her father were classmates there. But there's no evidence that Madison went to that school. In his autobiographical sketch, the only school Madison mentions attending was the one run by Donald Robertson in King and Queen County. Even if Anne Maury was mistaken about her father and Madison being schoolmates, she might be correct in believing that they had known each other since childhood. Now, in this last section of my talk, I'd like to look at several instances that reflect Madison and Maury's long personal friendship. This is a fascinating item that is not in our collection, but it surfaced in an online auction a few years ago. It's a copy of the Federalist Papers that was a gift from James Madison to James Maury in July 1788, around the time that Maury first began to market Madison's tobacco, and which supports the idea that Madison and Maury were already friends before they did business together. The Federalist essays, as you may know, were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They explained the political theory behind the Constitution and urged the people to ratify it. The essays were published under pseudonyms in New York newspapers between October 1787 and August 1788, and they also came out in book form in 1788. So this copy that Madison sent to Maury was a first edition, hot off the presses, and just weeks after the Constitution was ratified. And here you can see where James Maury wrote his own name in the book, and then added that it came from Mr. Madison, one of the supposed authors. It's interesting that Maury refers to Madison as one of the supposed authors. So did Madison not reveal to Maury that he was the author of at least 29 essays? Or was Maury attempting to preserve Madison's anonymity with this non-committal wording? Madison's letter accompanying the gift might have answered that question, but as far as we know, it doesn't survive. Maury did mention Madison's letter when he replied on February 24th, 1789, writing, "I have the honor of your much esteemed favor of 3rd July with the Federalist, for which I am particularly obliged to you." Maury was a friend to all of Madison's family, not just Madison himself. He welcomed a visit from Madison's stepson, excuse me, John Payne Todd, when Todd was in England during the War of 1812. Todd, who was in his early 20s, accompanied the peace delegation that eventually negotiated an end to the war, serving as a personal secretary to several members of the delegation. In the course of the negotiations, the delegation made a lengthy journey through several European countries. Todd was in England in 1815 and again in 1816, and paid at least one call on Maury, who later wrote, "When Mr. Todd was here, he gratified me much by telling me your venerable mother was still in the land of the living and well. Present, I pray you, my respectful remembrance to this old friend, whom I always greatly esteemed, and perhaps not the less for having somehow or other considered myself a sort of favorite of hers." Maury often ended his letters to James Madison with good wishes to Nellie Madison, again indicating his friendship with the entire family. In 1828, Maury sent kindest regards and best wishes to my venerable ancient friend, Nellie Madison. And in another letter that year, he sent kindest remembrance to my very, very ancient friend. Now, I'm not sure how Nellie Madison felt about the wording, but she was 97 when Maury wrote that in 1828. So hopefully she was proud of having reached that advanced age. And then finally, when Maury learned of Nellie Madison's death in 1829, he wrote to James Madison, "'Tis indeed with sorrowful regret I no longer can return my accustomed acknowledgments to that excellent mother for her kind remembrance of me. For I find she left you a few days after the date of your letter of 6th February. She has not only been blessed with long life, but also with the great ingredients for rendering it comfortable and happy, namely health, with a certain mildness and equanimity, for which I ever considered her remarkable." Maury himself turned 84 the following year, 1830, and Madison, then 79, sent this birthday wish. "I will not, my friend, in the Spanish fashion, wish you may live 1,000 years, but you have my best wishes that your remaining ones, whatever be their number, may experience all the blessings congenial with them." We don't know how Maury celebrated his birthday that year, but perhaps it was similar to his birthday in 1838, when his daughter Anne wrote to Dolly Madison that, "We have celebrated Papa's birthday. We had a very agreeable dinner party, and the old gentleman himself was in excellent spirits." Unfortunately for Maury, he lost his position as U.S. consul during the Andrew Jackson administration and returned to America in 1831. Madison was delighted to learn that Maury had landed in New York. He wrote excitedly, "The mail has just brought us information, in one instance under your own hand and name, that you have safely reached the land of your birth. I welcome you to it, and hope that at an early day to welcome you at my own domicile, where I shall be able to express all the feelings awakened by your unexpected and gratifying visit." You have to have read a lot of Madison's writings to know that's Madison writing excitedly. Maury wrote to Madison in June 1831 that he was in Spotsylvania County, and he hoped to visit Montpelier en route to Charlottesville. He wanted to see Madison, of course, but he also noted, "I much wish to be in the mountainous region as soon as I can, hoping to get rid of what the doctors term a nervous cough, which has sadly annoyed me of late. The southwest mountain air I consider my native air, or all but native, for I did breathe the King William air about 5 years before my father removed to Albemarle." James Maury's daughter Anne described her visit in the, excuse me, I'm going to start that sentence again. James Maury's daughter Anne described the visit in her diary entry of June 16th, 1831. "On our arrival at Mr. Madison's, he and his stepson, Mr. Todd, came out to hand us from the carriage. Papa was much affected at the meeting. Mrs. Madison joined us presently, and expressed great pleasure in seeing us. Mr. Madison, I think decidedly, one of the most agreeable gentlemen I have ever known, and I think myself fortunate in having had the opportunity of making his acquaintance. His fund of anecdote and conversation, and his agreeable talent for imparting information, conspire to render him, I may say, a fascinating man, though one generally considers a man of 80 years to be past the age of fascination. Mrs. Madison is likewise a very agreeable person, but in a different style altogether. Very kind and hospitable and cheerful. A most delightful visit we had at Montpelier, and we left it with regret on Wednesday the 22nd. A few months later, Maury's son William wrote to Madison, "I must now thank you for the flattering reception which you gave to that young man, my father. I would have given much to have witnessed your meeting, 81 and 85, after an interval of half a century or near it." All I can say is, me too. I would love to have witnessed that meeting. Maury visited again in 1833 and 1835. His daughter Anne reflected on the differences she saw during that final visit in a letter that she wrote to her brother while she was at Montpelier on August 6, 1835. We find Mr. Madison a good deal changed. His voice is weaker, apparently from some little difficulty of breathing, and he has become rather deaf. And Papa being deaf also, their conversation is less interesting to themselves than it used to be. Still, they seem to have much pleasure in meeting. I love that image of two old friends who just enjoy being in each other's company, even if it's too much effort to carry on a conversation. Sadly, that visit would be the last time they were together. James Madison died less than a year later, on June 28, 1836, at the age of 85. And incidentally, I would like to thank Russell Hooper, a Maury descendant, for sharing the text of this letter and many other family letters with Montpelier. Maury lived to be 94 years old. He was born 5 years before James Madison and survived him by another 4 years, dying in 1840. Madison and Maury's long friendship is recorded in their nearly as long correspondence, and their letters have been a real gift to those of us researching Montpelier as a plantation and Montpelier as a furnished home. James Maury may not be the first person you think of when you think about the history of the young United States. But one of the things I've enjoyed about studying James Madison for the past almost 14 years is getting to know some of the people Madison knew well. People who made up the fabric of the Madison social world. People who in many cases made important contributions in their own time, even if they're not as well remembered today. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know James Maury a little bit better through his relationship with James Madison. And I hope the next time you come to Montpelier, you'll see it a little bit differently for knowing another layer of the story. And now we have some time for questions.
Okay, one question I can see in the Q&A right now is from Robin, and she's referring to when you were talking about the bedroom and says India chintz or British manufacture. So we're talking about the fabrics in that bed chamber, and I don't know if you know, Hilarie, but
I don't know that off the top of my hand, I'm afraid.
Robin, I have your email address. I will find out for you. How about that? And I'll shoot you an email and get that answer for you. Another question I'm seeing here. It's Jeffrey picking up on a trend. James Madison, James Monroe, James Maury. There were many Virginians with at the time named James M. Or is it just a coincidence?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it it doesn't help that people tended to name their sons after the fathers, so that perpetuated as well. But yes, we do seem to have quite a few James M's in the story.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a British reference. You know, there were a lot of King Jameses. Why not name your kid after somebody who is politically successful at some point? So my guess is it's a British thing. And then Austin's asking, where is Maury buried?
I do not know, and I'm wondering if Megan knows.
Megan, our scholar
Putting you on the spot, Megan.
in text might know. So we'll give her a minute. Oh, there we go. There's our
Greenwood
answer.
Cemetery, Brooklyn, New
Greenwood.
York. Thank you, Megan.
In the Q&A, Bill asks, I always hear about Madison et al. Being short in cash and in debt. How much did they make and lose?
That is a good question for which we really don't have a specific numerical answer. One of the comments that Madison makes at one point in time, he's reflecting on how things have gone economically during his retirement. And he says that he basically only made one good, what he considered to be one good crop of tobacco and one good crop of wheat because of weather and pests. And the 2 times that he had the good crops, he didn't get as much for them as he thought would generate. So it seems that by Madison's time, the system was not working as well for the planters as it had a generation or so earlier. And so many in the 19th century, you kind of see a general economic decline in Virginia. You see a lot of the younger generation moving further west. And so certainly they were finding out that it was not as profitable as they thought it would be.
All right. Peter would like to know what occupation was James Maury's before he was sent to Liverpool?
Well, he was in a mercantile business with his brother Fontaine. So they were working together in Fredericksburg, and then he moves to Liverpool to handle the British end of the family business, and then he becomes consul as well.
Okay. Someone made a comment, not British, Scottish. These folks were Scots-Irish. I know Monroe was certainly Scottish. I don't know about Maury and Madison. I've always heard Madison had British origins. Hilarie, do you have a better sense of Madison's genealogy? I know there's a James Madison in there.
Yeah, I would say British for English for Madison.
Yeah.
We know that his, let's see, it would be 2 greats or 3 greats grandfather came from England. We're not quite as sure where in England he came from.
Yeah, that was my understanding too. But yeah, I'll certainly concede that Monroe was Scottish. We know Monroe is Scottish. Someone's asking Michael's asking how successful was Montpelier plantation? That's a hard one.
Based on what I was just talking about with how Madison reviewed his economic performance, it wasn't, I mean, how do I want to say this? Certainly the Madisons were in the upper echelon of the county. They had a lot of land, but as far as the crops producing income, it never seemed to quite keep up with their expenditures. And in the Madisons' case, I don't think they really were big spenders compared to Thomas Jefferson, who really did spend a lot on luxury goods. I don't think the Madisons spent wildly other than bailing people out of debt, which we all know Payne Todd's story, and that there was a lot of debt there. One of the things that I think people aren't as much aware of is that James Madison also bailed his brother-in-law out of debt. his brother-in-law was close to losing his house in Washington, D.C., and Madison bought it at a time when he basically says in a letter, I'm buying your house and I really am stretching myself to do it. And that actually is the house on Lafayette Square where Dolly Madison ends up living as a widow. So Madison tried to take care of the people in his circle and was perhaps overextending himself in that regard.
Mary is asking, is George Driver, the owner of Farmington, a friend of Jefferson and Madison, mentioned in correspondence to Maury?
That is a good question. And if I went back to our database, I could probably find some examples where that's the case. I didn't see his name come up in the particular things I was looking for this talk.
And I also want to add, Megan says that Maury's father was the child of a Huguenot. So just to give you more context on the historical background of Maury. Austin asks, did Madison sell other crops besides wheat and tobacco? If so, were they exported to Britain?
The enslaved laborers on the Montpelier plantation raised more crops than just wheat and tobacco, but wheat and tobacco were the ones that were raised for sale. So the other crops raised at Montpelier were for the use on the plantation. So vegetables and fruit, and they did a little with textiles, a little with linen, not so much with cotton. They raised some sheep for wool, but other than a few instances like where they tried to sell some of the merino wool when they started keeping merino sheep at Montpelier, but that, like many other economic endeavors, just didn't seem to be very profitable.
A lot of questions about Montpelier as a property. Judith is asking, I wonder if the economic decline was partly due to the fact that tobacco was so hard on the soil. Maybe it took time to turn things around to grow wheat or other crops.
Yeah, I think the depletion of the soil did have a lot to do with it. And the level of scientific knowledge at the time to really understand what was going on with the soil, not everybody was embracing the newer, more progressive methods of farming. Madison gave an address to the Agricultural Society of Albemarle in 1818, and he was advocating for things like using fertilizer to try to restore some fertility of the soil, doing contour plowing instead of just plowing up and down in straight lines. So he was trying to do things in a more scientific or more rational approach. Thomas Jefferson is supposed to have said that he was the best farmer in the world. And I think that might have been true from the standpoint of trying to understand the theory behind farming. But as far as being economically successful, he always seemed to be a little bit of a step behind. He knows what Maury or what some of his local factors were telling him were the qualities that the buyers were looking for in tobacco in the market this year, and he would accommodate for that. But by the next year, the buyers were looking for something different. So it was always a moving target.
And finally, is there any info on Mrs. Maury?
I didn't look for any. That's the topic for Women's History Month.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't research her. I just looked at him.
Yeah, I think it's one of those cases where a lot of times when the guys are writing, the women get overlooked a little bit.
There you go.
But yeah, you all had some wonderful questions. And again, I do want to reiterate this. If there is a topic that you are particularly interested in, I put my email in the chat. You are always welcome to email me directly and say, hey, Emily, I really want to hear about this particular topic. And if we get a request, we can always put programs together and come up with new things. And so it sounds like a lot of you all are interested in the farming and agricultural work at Montpelier. So if that's something you're interested in, we can definitely look at putting together a program maybe, later this year and see what's going on. Megan says there's a definitely a history with Mrs. Maury, but it's too long to be typed. Maybe we need to have a part 2 of the series, or yeah, like you said, Hilarie, maybe for maybe for Women's History Month.
Maybe we need to have Megan as a
Yeah, I think
star
Megan,
with
you need to come on and join us one day if you fall up to it. That'd be great, and give us a little bit more information about maybe how Mrs. Maury and Dolly or whoever interacted and what's going on there. That would be a good one, Hilarie.
Yeah.
I can think of a couple of wonderful scholars to talk about Dolly and, her circles and people that she hung out with and women at the time and how they compare to each other. And so that might be something we'll have to look forward to. All right. I'll give another minute or so if there's any last minute questions. Michael wants to know, did Maury not send books to Madison?
That is a good question. I haven't seen references to him sending books. It may have been the case, but when we think of Madison getting books, we often think of Thomas Jefferson, who bought quite a lot of books for him in France. And then a lot of the books that Madison was getting during his retirement years came from the authors of books who oftentimes were looking for essentially a celebrity endorsement for their book.
Well, on that note, if you all don't have any other questions, we're going to let you go tonight. Thank you all for joining us for this first one for 2024.
Thank you.
We hope to see you on site this year. We hope the year is great for you. Yeah, we'll see you in the next talk. I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording, and you all have a